Muito bom, gente, eu queria chamar o Aaron agora. O Aaron é um cara, para mim, muito importante. Assim, alguns livros, foi Organizações Exponenciais há algum tempo, fazem você parar e repensar o olhar que você tem para a corporação, né? O Aaron é um desses caras, ele é de uma consultoria chamada The Ready e tem um livro chamado Brave New Work, que também irá para tradução em breve. E ele topou vir aqui com a gente para compartilhar também, né? Nos últimos 10 anos, ele pensa muito em organizações e como é que a gente constrói uma nova forma de trabalhar que a adaptabilidade e a autonomia sejam um momento importante. Eu acho importante dizer que ele não é da área de L&D, de aprendizagem e desenvolvimento, mas ele é um cara que tem um monte de ensinamento e é um cara que vai ensinar muito a gente hoje. Ele já está aqui, não? Vinheta para ele. Hi, Aaron. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
It's the same old, beautiful scenario that you have behind you. It's a beautiful place. Just because you're recording.
He won. He won the best background today.
The best background today is yours, I have to say.
Thank you.
So Aaron, thank you. I was just telling the guys here how important your work is for us. And so thank you for you to be here to share knowledge with the Brazilian people. And the stage is yours.
Perfect, thank you so much. I want to tell the story of Brave New Work today, and I start every speech I have given all around the world in almost 20 countries now with this slide, and I ask the audience what year it's from. And though I can't hear each of you, I am sure you're thinking to yourself, 1950, 1900, 1980, 2020. There are lots of possibilities. It's actually from the year 1910. It's 111 years old now. And what is fascinating about that is, had I shown you a picture of almost anything else, it could have been a house, a dress, a shoe, a phone, a car, you would have had a much better idea of what year it was from than an org chart. And why is that? It seems to me that this is something that hasn't changed in over a century because one of two things is true. Either it's perfect, and we can all go back to work in our pyramids, or it's just really hard to change. It's really hard to imagine ourselves in a system where we structure and organize any way other than this. And that is a perplexing thing. And that's what led me down the path to investigate the research in the book, Brave New Work. I have one more pop quiz for you, and that is these ways of working. So these are 5 ways of showing up at work. And I want you to look at each one and reflect, have you seen a colleague, yourself, a boss, behave in this way at work? Insisting on doing everything through the right channels, never shortcutting to make decisions faster, referring matters to committees and making those committees as large as possible, haggling over the precise wording of communications, both internal and external, marketing, org change announcements, announcements about what we need to be focused on, referring back to things we decided in the last meeting and trying to reopen and re-argue, maybe we should have made a different decision. And finally, multiplying the procedures and the clearances and the general process around things like issuing instructions, paying checks, all the sort of general operational procedures. See that 3 people or 4 or 5 or 10 have to sign off on something when maybe 1 would be enough. And so I would ask you for kind of a virtual show of hands, who has ever seen this behavior at work? And what I find in most groups is that about 85 to 95% of the people in the audience are like, guilty. I have definitely seen this either in my current company or a previous company. And maybe I've even done it myself. I know I've certainly done the haggling over precise wordings one. But what is interesting about these ways of working is that I did not collect them from observing organizations. I did not collect them going around the world talking to and studying organizations. I got them from a different place, and a place that is far more interesting. I got them from the guide on how to sabotage a company that was written by the American CIA in the middle of World War II. And in the middle of World War II, the precursor to what would become the American CIA commissioned a study. And they knew that they had people behind enemy lines that were sympathetic, that were aligned with us in the conflict. And they basically said, what can we do with these people? How can we slow this economy down? How can we hurt this enemy state? And this guide was written. And at the end of it, there's a whole chapter on what we can do with our organizations. What can we do to grind our organizations to a halt, to stop them in their tracks and to get in the way? And those 5 ideas that I just read to you were among about 14 that verbatim are present in this document from 1946. And so in the space of a single human lifetime, we have gone from those ideas being obvious sabotage, even to the bureaucracy of a government, to them being kind of normal at work now. This is just the world that we live in. Most people are experiencing those ideas, those concepts. And there are many more where that came from. So if you're curious, I highly recommend that you Google the Guide to Simple Sabotage and see what you can find out and learn. But this is troubling, right? Something about the way we work has shape-shifted, has become dangerous over time, and it has gotten in the way. Now, when you talk to people about their lived experience of this, you hear things like this. About 1 in 2 are thinking about quitting their job at any given time. Roughly 1 in 2 are unhappy in the current job that they have, so they're not loving it anyway. Roughly 1 in 2 are not engaged. And engagement with the organization that does this survey is defined as, are you feeling like you have connection to the work, that you're making meaning, that you are motivated by the work, or are you kind of working for the weekend, working for a chance to take a break and go do what you actually love to do, what actually gives you meaning? And so half the workforce is not engaged, and this is across millions of data points. And then finally, 1 in 5 or 6 are actively disengaged, which you could almost define as sabotage. They are people that are actively backstabbing their colleagues or their business, trying to get ahead, doing whatever it takes to disrupt the normal order of things. They're just frustrated to the point where they're making a mess. And so that's the world that we live in. That's, for most countries, for most continents, this is the shape of work. About 1 in 2 people don't want to be there. And about 1 in 6 people really don't like the system that they're a part of. And we just sort of go on about our business. I mean, this data has been looking like this for about 20 or 30 years. The world has not really stopped to pay attention or do anything about it. And ping pong tables and snack stations have not helped. And yet, if this were a dinner party at your home, if you invited 100 people to your home and 50 of them really didn't want to be there and 15 or 16 of them actively hated you, it would be the worst party you've ever been to. And you would immediately do something to change it. So there's a real risk there that we have to expose ourselves to. Now, some people don't care about the human experience. Many times I'll be in a boardroom and talking to leaders, and most people will be interested in what I just shared. But some people are like, look, business is not about making people happy. We should be focused on the bottom line, what's happening, with our math. And the news there is not great either. I mean, certainly if you look at the top 5 or 10 stocks in the stock market, they're carrying everyone else. If you look at GDP, you see a story that looks sort of like growth, but when you actually look down under the covers, it's not nearly as good. So the economy-wide return on assets, so that's how much money we make for the stuff that we own as a company, has been down and to the right for the last many, 50, 60 years. So that means our parents and grandparents made more profit from the stuff they owned than we do, and yet we have computers in our pocket more powerful than the ones that took them to the moon. So that's troubling. And then if you look at average company lifespan, it's also down and to the right. So it used to be dynastic. If you were on the S&P 500 in the 1950s or 60s, you'd be on there for an entire generation or two. Now it's 10, 12 years on average, and it means that every couple years, 1 in 2 companies has a chance of falling off. It's really hard to stay big and relevant for a long time anymore. There's too much pressure to change, too much going on. And frankly, a lot of M&A to make up for it, a lot of mergers and acquisitions to hide the lack of innovation, the lack of longevity that's really going on. So of course you have to ask what's happening, right? What's really going on under the hood here? Why do the numbers look this way? Why are we okay with it? What's really the meaning behind this? And if you ask people that are experts, if you ask economists, if you ask, business people at the top of their game, they'll give you a lot of reasons, right? There's a whole range of things you could point to that would talk about, productivity growth slowing down and why that is. And we already found all the big innovations of planes, trains, and automobiles, and yada, yada, yada. It's like asking a doctor why kids have more food allergies today. Nobody knows, but there's lots of explanations. But if you ask people that work at the front lines, people that work at a cash register, waiting a table, building software, answering a customer support request, dealing with the people that are actually out there in the world, they all say the same thing. What's happened is bureaucracy. We have so much red tape, so many rules, so many regulations, so many things we have to jump through that we're unable to think. We're unable to be creative. We're unable to learn. We're expected to behave like machines. And behaving like machines does not leave room for the two things that we're really good at, which are creativity and human judgment. That's what we actually bring to the table. That's the thing that is difficult to automate away. And bureaucracy is a funny word. It means rule by desk, to be ruled by a desk, which is sort of appropriate. But I also find it's a word that people blame things on without really understanding it. So people will just say, hey, it's bureaucracy's the problem. But what is bureaucracy? Well, I don't really know. And so I like to think of a different term, which is the term organizational debt. So everyone on the call probably understands financial debt. You borrow money, you have to pay interest back on that money after you borrow it. Many of you who work in and around technology may also understand technical debt. Technical debt is we ship it, we hurry to get it out the door, we make decisions right now to produce our software or our hardware. And then later on, as things change, as it scales, as the world turns, we have to refactor or edit that software or that hardware to make it applicable to the current situation. And that's called technical debt. And both of those are frustrating. But there's a third kind of debt that we call organizational debt. And organizational debt, I think, is the worst of all. Organizational debt is the tax we pay when we don't adapt the way we work, our processes, our policies, our norms, the way we do things for the current situation. We just let things linger on and on and on. And there are so many examples of this. The meeting on Monday that nobody enjoys, the 5-person review that has to happen at the bank because one person made a mistake one year. The inability of an employee to stay over at the company's corporate retreat center because their house is close enough that they don't have to, that they can't stay at work even though they worked until 2 a.m. There are all these little boundaries and rules that don't make sense when you just really talk them out loud, but that have become part of the way we work. And I even worked with one organization recently where they had a monthly strategy meeting that no one enjoyed, that no one felt was adding value, that the people that had it had not created. It had been inherited from people before them. And when we modeled the value of the meeting, the cost of the meeting, it was like $3 million. So they were spending $3 million a year to be in this meeting that nobody enjoyed, that nobody invented, that they just inherited from the people that no longer even work at the company. There are so many examples like that where we're just sitting on value. And some friends of ours, Gary Hamill and Michele Zanini, have modeled the value of all this stuff. If you look at roles we don't need because we're too layered, and you look at policies we don't need because even the people that created the policies say they're not really that important, there's a value to that. And that value in the US right now is $3.4 trillion a year. And if you look at it globally, it is $9 trillion a year. So we are sitting on $9 trillion of waste. Waste in the form of roles and managers we don't need, waste in the form of policies we don't need, waste in the form of compliance activity we don't need. And I'm not saying we don't need any. There's lots of stuff we need to do. There are lots of things that need to be done legally and otherwise. But there's a lot of stuff that we've invented and carried forward that we don't need anymore. Now, why do we do this to ourselves? Why are we so stubborn in our creation of and maintenance of all this organizational debt? Well, it's because we don't understand the difference between these two words. Most people think complicated and complex mean the same thing, and they don't. If you talk to a systems theorist, they'll tell you, oh, no, these are different types of systems and they work differently. So I thought I would do like the 60-second master's degree in systems theory with you all on these two words right now. So let's start by considering what's what. A watch. Is a watch a complicated system or a complex system? Think to yourself. Is an engine a complicated system or a complex system? All right, let's raise the stakes. What about weather? Is weather a complicated system or a complex system? And finally, traffic. Is traffic a complicated system or a complex system? Now, I don't know what you were reflecting to yourself, and maybe you're great at this, but most groups, I get about 1/3 of the hands for one, I get 33% of the hands for the other, and I get 33% of people that are staring at me like, I'm not going to vote. I don't trust you, I don't know, and I don't like this. And the reality is, why would we know, right? We don't study these things at work. We're busy writing emails. But the reality is they matter a lot. So let's go back and get it right. So complicated, complex. These two systems, watches and engines, are what we would call complicated. They're causal systems. There's a cause and effect relationship inside them. They're predictable. They're knowable. They're teachable. You can build mastery in these areas and really kind of not be surprised, right? These systems are unlikely to surprise an expert. When you take your watch in or your car into the mechanic, they're very likely, they're very rarely saying whoa, I don't understand. They're going, oh yeah, it's another timing belt. It's another pattern I've seen before. And there may be lots of options and possibilities about what they can do, ways to approach the problem, but it's fundamentally not going to be super surprising what's going on. These systems, weather, traffic, and I would add to this list gardens, 6-year-old children, pets. These are complex systems. By that, I mean they're dispositional. They have a disposition or an attitude, a way they're trending, but we can't be sure exactly what will happen, right? The weather comes in, maybe it'll snow 10 inches, maybe it'll snow 1 inch. Maybe it'll be a hot day, maybe it'll be a really hot day. You can't know until you get right up to the moment exactly what will happen in a complex system. It's not predictable, it's not knowable. And as a result, complex systems tend to surprise us, right? We think, oh man, my kid just dropped out of college, he's not gonna make it. Well, maybe that kid is Mark Zuckerberg. There are all sorts of possibilities about what happened in a complex system, and we can't predict them all. And these systems, as a result, whereas a complicated system like a watch or an engine can be fixed, these systems cannot be fixed. Problems in a complex system can only be managed. They cannot be solved. Nobody ever comes in from working in the garden and says, honey, I fixed the garden. I solved the garden. That's not how it works. And nobody ever picks their child up from school and the teacher says, I fixed your kid. Your kid has been solved. That's not how kids work. You raise a kid forever. You're a parent forever. You are a gardener forever. You are tending these systems, and that is the nature of them. Now, it begs the question then, if we have complexity in our systems, organizations, of course, have lots of people in them. And so because they have lots of people, they have lots of complexity. They also operate in markets, and markets have lots of complexity. To manage this complexity, we need a different operating system, a different OS. And obviously in a computer, that OS is a technical system, but in an organization, that OS is just the system. What are the agreements that we make? What are the decisions that we make? How do we structure the organization? How do we allocate our resources? How do we think about information flows, et cetera? And that information kind of all fits into what we think of as an operating system. So these 12 spaces from our research are the 12 spaces that seem to be changing the most in the face of the future of work. So if we think about what we need to learn to do differently or unlearn that we've been taught, these are spaces where some things are shifting. So everything from our purpose and how we think about that, to how we make decisions and who has power, to how we do strategy, to how we meet, to how we do mastery, right? How we grow and mature and do learning and development and all those sorts of things. Those are all moving. And when we ask companies that are known for being especially innovative, responsive, adaptive, human-centric, future-proof, and say, what's different about the way you work? They mention things in these areas. We pay differently. We decide differently. We structure teams differently. We move information around more transparently. They all have stories to tell about ways they're doing these things differently. And it's interesting when you think about your operating system, most organizations think that they have a choice between two ends of a spectrum. We can have chaos, which is, nobody's in charge, no rules, no roles, no clarity. And that's what most startups start with, right? Most startups start with a lot of chaos. They don't know what they do and how they do it. Or we can have bureaucracy, a rule for everything, a role for everything in its place. And what's funny is when you talk to either of these groups, they don't like the other one. So the startups are saying, well, we don't want to become some big old tired dinosaur bureaucracy. And the bureaucracies are saying, look, we'd love to be faster, but we can't act like these startups and have no structure. We have operations in 150 countries. There's no way that we can do that, right? And so they feel stuck. And what's funny is, and this is almost always true, there's a third way. And the third way is a different way to think about our option of how we run the business. And it's based on a different set of constraints. So there are constraints, there are no constraints in the chaos setting. There are governing constraints, which are like bright line rules in the bureaucracy setting. And there are enabling constraints in the third way. So let's talk about what that means. There are two ways to solve this problem. You think about this as two different operating systems. The problem is two roads crossing. How do we maximize the flow of traffic, minimize accidents? On the left, there are one set of assumptions about people in the problem. On the right, there are a different set of assumptions, things that we think about people and the problem. And they create two different operating systems and two different realities. On the left, the assumption is people need to be told what to do. On the right, the assumption is they'll figure it out. And it basically boils down to two different ideologies, right? And of course, if you think people have to be told what to do, you have to build a lot of apparatus. You have to build lights and signals and electrical and algorithms and control centers and lines. And on the right, if you think that people can figure it out, you design a solution that allows them to have the space to do that. And both of these have governing constraints in them. In the light, everything is a bright line rule, a red tape. On the left, rather. On the right, there's one governing constraint, which is you have to go in the same direction as the other cars. But there's an enabling constraint that's super powerful, which is that you give the right of way to the people in the circle. So you decide when can I come in? When will I go out? And there's a lot of flexibility in that. So of course, it begs the question then, which one of these is safer? Which one of these moves more cars through it per hour? Which one of these, is cheaper to build and maintain? Which one of these works better when the power goes out? And on balance, the answer to all those questions is the roundabout, the one on the right. It just works better in most situations. Now, that doesn't mean all situations. There are plenty of places where a light makes sense, but there are 1,000 times more lights in the world, 1,000 times more. And yet the thing on the right is more effective. And that to me is the perfect metaphor for what's going on at work. There are places where control and compliance make sense, where they're needed. And there are a lot of places where trust and autonomy could work well or work better. But we have 1,000 times more of the left than the right. And we have to choose, I think, the work of our generation is to look at how we budget, how we decide, how we hire, how we fire, how we give feedback, how we think about learning, and say, where do we want to be on this spectrum? Not where were we, not where were our parents, not where were our bosses before us, but where do we want to be? And deliberately choose that place. Now, there are 3 companies I brought today out of the 68 that I've studied for the book that are asking that question and have been asking it in some cases for decades. And so I'm going to very quickly mention some of the wild things they're doing. Morningstar Tomato Processing is a company that literally processes tomatoes in California. They're the world's largest tomato processor, I believe. It's a multi-billion-dollar company. And they basically write their own job descriptions and set their own salaries every year. Thousands of people. They just do it with what's called an advice process. And the advice process means you can do whatever you want, but you have to listen to the thoughts of those around you, and then you have to work with them for the rest of the year. And what's funny is most people that hear that, especially when I do this at big universities, are like, oh my God, people setting their own salaries, what hell hath they brought forth unto this earth? But what's funny is, the average profitability in their space is a couple percent a year. These guys have averaged 20% profitability for over 20 years. So there's something different going on there. The other example I brought today was the USS Santa Fe. This is a nuclear submarine. And the captain or commander of this ship actually came on the Brave New Work podcast recently to talk about it. But he was asked to take over the lowest performing ship in the fleet. He was asked to turn around that ship without firing anyone. He had to keep the team that was on it. And the way he did it is that they realized as a team that him giving orders was not going to get the ship to the top of the ranks. Instead, when people would come to him and ask for orders, he would say, "What do you intend to do?" And they would say, "What?" He'd say, "What do you intend to do?" Instead of asking me for an order. I don't know. And so they would go think about it. They'd come back. "I intend to dock the ship. I intend to refuel. I intend to do this training exercise. I intend to clean this area." And almost every time he would say, "Very well." And pretty soon everybody on the ship learned that they were in charge of their own success. They did a bunch of other experimentation around that OS of the ship over the years to come. But 2 years later, it was the top performing ship in the fleet. It has produced more officers than I think any other ship in naval history. There's a great story about this written in the book, Turning the Ship Around. I highly recommend it. And then the last example I brought for today is Haier, which is a Chinese appliance manufacturer. And Haier has gone through many transformations, but most recently has gone through a transformation around the operating system. And the CEO Shang was looking at the world and realizing, like, we're too disconnected from customer. We have all these big functions, marketing, analysis, customer support, design, engineering. Nobody knows who their customer is anymore. And so they blew the company up, but not in a traditional private equity way. They blew it up by just breaking it down into 2,000 autonomous teams of 10 to 30 people each. Each one owned a P&L. Each one had a customer. Each one owned a product or a service, either internal or external. And they practiced the art of entrepreneurship. They also had a vote with your feet model, where if you didn't want to be on the team you were on and another team would have you, you could just walk over to the other team and now you're on another team. And as long as their P&L balanced, everything was okay. If something was growing, it could attract more people. If something was shrinking, of course, it would go away. They didn't have to kill bad products because bad products would kill themselves. And then if you had a new idea, you would pitch it to a VC partner, a venture capital partner of the firm. And if they invested, Haier would match it. And now you had your own P&L. Today, there are, I think, 4 or up to 6,000 of these teams. The company's gone from 60 to 80,000 people. They've become the fastest growing appliance manufacturer in human history, and they're not done. It's not that it was not without disruption. There was a lot of challenges in this process for them, but it is a very interesting story to read and learn more about. And it is the largest scaled example of thinking differently about how we work that I am aware of in history. So what do they all have in common? Well, they all have in common these 2 ideas. They're people positive and they're complexity conscious. People positive means that they believe that people are worthy of trust and respect, that people are adaptive, that they're chameleons to their environment, that they will behave like you expect them to behave, and that they are motivated by autonomy, mastery, and purpose rather than carrots and sticks. Bonuses are not what motivate people. Being yelled at is not what motivates people. What motivates people is learning, growing, developing, working on something that makes meaning in the world, having the freedom to do it without a lot of oversight. And complexity conscious is this idea that we talked about before, that not everything is a watch. Some things are complicated. Some things are, some things are complex, and we have to accept and adopt that. So here we go. Let's change, right? Except the problem is when I get to this part of the presentation, most people go, "Hey, I love these ideas. This is beautiful thinking, but change doesn't work. You can't change my company. We've tried. We've done so many change efforts before." And I have to say, you're right. Like 80 to 90% of all change management fails to deliver what it sets out to deliver. And people feel that. They know that. They've had that experience. But there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that we think of change like this. Change is something terrible that happens to us, and we have to claw our way back out. It's like a grieving process for losing a loved one. This is not the only way to do change. This is not what all change looks like. If I offered everyone on the call today a new car, You wouldn't all be like, oh no, how will we adapt to the new status quo? You'd be like, thank you for the car. This is awesome. That's change, but it's change that doesn't bother you, right? And by the way, if you have a very expensive consulting company, the process can look like this. It's the same thing, but in 3D. None of that really gets us there, right? Now that you know about complexity, you know that no one organization is in one place. There are many teams in many different places. The average need of the organization is not the local need of the team. And so if we really want to change, we need to change how we change. If we really want to realize a different way of being, we got to do it differently. And there's this quote that I love, start the way you mean to finish. Start the way you mean to finish. Do you mean to finish as a transparent, adaptive, fast-growing, high-trust organization? Cool. Don't run your change program with a Gantt chart and a 16-month plan and 15 reviews with the leadership team, because you won't end up where you want to end up if you do it that way. Instead, we like to do it through continuous participatory change. Teach every team at every level to do one simple thing. Tune into tension. What's stopping us? What's holding us back? What's preventing us from doing the best work of our lives? Consider alternative practices. What's a different way we could work? What's a different way we could do this? What's out there at Morningstar, at the USS Santa Fe, at Hire that we could borrow? And then experiment. Let's do a safe to try, safe to fail experiment, not at the scale of the whole company, but somewhere where we can learn if this is right for us. And we live in this loop, every team at every level, as we adapt the organization, as we adjust the operating system. And the things that work spread, they spread naturally. And the things that don't work go away. And it is a living system. Now I want to leave you with one quick story before we do a tiny bit of Q&A. This is the high jump in the 60s, in the early 60s and before. This is how the high jump was done. You jumped over front ways and you landed on your feet. And you did it that way for a very good reason. There was nothing but dirt on the other side of the pole. So if you jumped and you landed on your back, you would break yourself. You have to land on your feet because of the dirt. But then in the mid to late 60s, these different foams and synthetic fabrics and materials came along and the rules changed. And suddenly it was possible to not land on your feet. And a young man named Dick Fosbury was at a high school in Oregon, and he started to go over head first and backwards. And his coaches said, stop that. That's not how we do the high jump. And then he went to the University of Oregon and he kept going over head first and backwards. And his track coaches there said, please stop. So he did. He started going over the normal way, but they weren't winning track meets. And they knew that he could go higher backwards. So they let him do it. And he did it and did it and did it. And suddenly his height kept exploding better and better and better and better. He went to the 1968 Olympics, won the gold medal, broke the Olympic world record for the high jump. No one but one person has ever won the world record for the high jump with any technique other than this since then. And why I tell this story is not because he thought differently and he was an iconoclast and all this. That's true and that's interesting. It's innovative. But actually it's, what did the other competitors say? And the other competitors, when he was doing this, after he won the gold medal, said, hey, it works for Dick, but it won't work for us. And here's why. Our culture, our bodies, our differences, yada, 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 yada. It works for Dick, it works for this guy, it won't work for us. And what I find when I travel the world telling this story and talking about the 68, 78, 88 companies that I've seen working and thinking differently, I get a lot of that. I get oh, well, that's great that Handelsbanken can do that, but our regulators are different. Oh, it's amazing that Google did that, but we're not a software company. Oh, it's fantastic that Inspiral does that, but we don't really believe in those things. Everybody has an excuse for why thinking differently about the way they work just won't work for them. And as someone who's complexity conscious, I hope, I have to admit, I don't know. Maybe it isn't for you. But you also have to admit, you don't know either. The only way to know in a complex system is to try. The only way to find out if working differently, if not having a vacation policy, if having an unlimited spending policy, if having a different way of allocating resources, if letting people choose their team, if letting people choose their pay could work, the only way to know is to try. And you don't have to try it with everybody. You can try it with 5 people. You can try it with 10 people. You can learn something. And that is the power and the spirit of Brave New Work. And I thank you for letting me share that with you today.
To listen to you again. I mean, part of, the reason that I start everything the new way, thinking only about learning culture, not trying to promote traditional L&D, it's because of the book, because of the way you think. And so I have time for one question. And when I read the book, and even listen to you right now, it means that you're talking specifically to the L&D guys. Meaning, learning is not complicated. Learning is complex.
Totally.
And you don't believe in people because you have all the control system on where they click and how much time they spend on screen. So basically, how do you see, and even the loop and the OS canvas we use in this projects, because it's so similar when you think in the whole organization and only in the L&D function. So how do you see learning inside the organization through your lens?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of things. One is that, learning can be centralized, but it can also be decentralized. So there are certainly value in a central L&D organization providing content and learning opportunities to a system. There's also a lot of value and opportunity in a peer-to-peer system. So I have studied several companies where they have massive peer-to-peer learning systems, from Google to Etsy to others, where they're teaching each other things that are related to work and things that are unrelated to work. And so I think peer-to-peer is very interesting. I think, the different learning styles that we all have, the complexity of that is very interesting to acknowledge. So I've seen, text-based learning and video-based and live cohort and reading and listening. So I think you have to think about a multi-channel strategy because of how different each of us is in the way we like to learn. And then the last thing I would say is that, in complexity, the real true learning can only happen on the job. So you can do pretend stuff, you can study books, you can do scenarios, you can pretend, but the actual learning comes in contact with reality. And so having people have more chances to try things, to be in the actual situation, whether that be a sales opportunity, a creative opportunity, whatever it is, having more at-bats, more chances to swing the bat is actually one of the most important things for learning. So I think that's critical. I guess the last thing I would say is I've seen, and we're starting to think at the Ready about some interesting opportunities around badging and having badging be decentralized. So do you have a certain credential within the system to be able to do X, Y, or Z? Well, that can come from a badge, but that badge can be owned by a community of practice. So the write a scope of work badge at the Ready could be held by people that have written a lot of scopes of work and can be offered to people that come into that system as an apprentice and build their mastery up to a point where now they're a part of that community of practice. So I think badging and decentralized badging is also super interesting. Beyond that, there's so much out there that I don't know and that I'm humble to. So I'm excited to see what the next generation of learning designers create.
We should do some project together on learning with Novi and the Ready so that we can discover what's going on with the different companies.
That'd be awesome.
Okay, thank you a lot, Aaron. Really, it was very important from all of us here in the Brazilian L&D community to know a little bit about your work. And as I told you, we are going to be translated the book probably by the end of the year. So Brave New Work is going to be here in Portuguese. You're giving us a hard time translating the title, but we are trying to do it. Thank you a lot.
That's exciting. Thank you.
Thank you.